You're listening to The Art of Procurement, episode 127.
Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hi there, everybody, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement. I hope you've been enjoying a great start to the spring or the autumn, wherever you are in the world. And today I'm really thrilled to be joined by Jim Butler. Jim is the Chief Procurement Officer for my home state of California. And to give some context of the scope of Jim's responsibility, according to the World Bank, the state of California has the sixth largest economy in the world after the US itself, China, Japan, Germany, and the UK. And prior to joining the state of California, Jim enjoyed a successful career as a CPO for Levi Strauss and then held a number of senior procurement leadership positions with Dell Computer. And in today's conversation, I wanted to learn about the leadership role that the state of California is taking in building sustainability into its supply chain and in providing opportunities for small and local businesses. And CSR and sustainability are often topics that I think we talk about in procurement, but it's fair to say that the best practices are not necessarily widely implemented. So Jim shared some of his experiences in California, along with the added dimensions, and these create both opportunities and challenges of actually doing so within a public body. I also asked Jim to share some of his experiences in making the leap from private to public procurement. I've only ever actually experienced procurement in for-profit companies, and so while I've often theorized about the differences and obviously, some of the similarities too, I actually really enjoy getting Jim's real-world perspective on making the switch. And just one last thing, so Jim and I met through a mutual connection at the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, otherwise known as the SPLC. And you might actually recall last year I talked with the president and CEO of the SPLC, Jason Pearson. So if you're interested in CSR, do go back and check out that episode. Today is actually the first of two episodes we have coming up on the topic of sustainability. The second will air in a couple of weeks' time when we look at the experiences from a private enterprise perspective. I think it's important now more than ever before that companies take the lead in CSR and in sustainability, making sure to tie those into real-world benefits, whether they be financial benefits or reputational benefits. And actually, Jim provides some pointers as to how to do that. If you do nothing else today, I'd love for you just to go and check out SPLC and the upcoming SPLC Summit in Denver, in Colorado, which takes place on May the 8th to May the 10th. And what I'll do is I'll include links to both of those in the show notes for today's episode. All right, I have one very last thing to share with you this week. So I'm working with Art of Procurement alumni Stephanie Lapierre, the CEO and founder of Tealbook, and also with the Hackett Group to facilitate a small number of roundtables at the end of April. And the purpose of the roundtables is for a small number of CPOs and procurement leaders to come together and discuss the results of a recent Hackett Group study on supplier discovery and knowledge management practices within procurement. The intent is to convert those findings into really impactful thought leadership with the help of the practitioners who will be present at those roundtables. This is an invitational event, but I've actually been able to secure just a couple of spaces at the roundtables in Philadelphia and Chicago for Art of Procurement listeners. So if you are a CPO or a procurement executive based in either one of those cities, and you're interested in really shaping industry thought leadership in the realm of supplier discovery, then please do let me know. I will pass on your details to the Tealbook team. So hi everybody and welcome to today's Art of Procurement. And today I'm really honoured to be joined by Jim Butler, and Jim is the Chief Procurement Officer for my home state of California. So Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Phil. I really appreciate your invitation.
No, I'm really honored that you would join me. And the first question that I have is something that I'm asking a lot of CPOs as my first question, just so that listeners can get to know you a little bit more. What are you passionate about right now when it comes to your day-to-day work and procurement and how that kind of fits into the procurement community?
It's such a great question. I am very, very passionate at this stage of my career and in the work that we're doing about partnerships. And for us in California, that's happening right now in a few different areas. With our CIO, we're undertaking an important IT procurement reform effort. For years, we've made it very almost difficult for our state customers to find the contracts that we stand up. In fact, we teach a lot of training classes to teach people how to work their way through the labyrinth of options. And through the inspiration of our CIO, we're actually going to be simplifying that, really putting an easy-to-access interface on the front of that so that the state agencies can quickly find the things that they want. So we're very excited about that partnership. Another that we're working on, we've been part of for a number of years, but is really important to us, is our membership in the National Association of State Procurement Officials, NASPO. NASPO does a couple of really important things for us. One, professional development. They provide a really terrific set of resources for our state buyers to really become professionals in the art of public procurement. They also have a very successful cooperative, contracting cooperative. That the cooperative does about $12 billion a year worth of sourcing across all the 50 states. And we get amazing leverage out of that because there's so many other states and the procurement work that they do. It allows us, as well as all the cities and counties and schools in California, to take advantage of those contracts. Then the last big partnership that we just embarked on within the last year is with the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council. And SPLC has been critical, really important to us in helping to drive sustainable purchasing in California. And we've had a green purchasing program for years, but only now, through our partnership with SPLC, are we starting to get to a place where we can measure the program and benchmark ourselves against others like us. So, for me, partnerships is just key right now.
Does that kind of commitment to partnership, and does that change how you work with suppliers too? So you're looking at suppliers in a different way, perhaps from a collaboration perspective than what I think we traditionally have a function have done in the past, and we still do today, is looking at things as more of a transaction. So has that spilled over to how you work with partners?
It is starting to. My career in the private sector, we had a lot of success with our partnerships with suppliers. We learned very quickly to drive innovation in a relationship instead of trying to wring every last penny out of the cost. However, in the public sector, there's a very bright line between how we can collaborate with bidders. So once a contract is in place, we are generally restricted to only work on the things that were the subject of the bid. But we have been able to find some innovative approaches that allow us to do negotiations. So it's my hope that will grow, but I couldn't agree with you more that that's a really important way to work with your suppliers.
Right. What motivated you to make that switch from private to public? I think it's, 8 or 9 years since, I think most recently you were CPO of Levi Strauss, but it's a big jump, a big difference, I'm guessing.
Yeah, it really has been. It's been very rewarding. In fact, it has been almost 9 years. It will be 9 years in May. And I really enjoyed the work I was doing in the private sector, companies like Levi, like you mentioned, and Dell Computer Corporation. What I was looking for, though, was a bigger problem to work on. And the scale that we get here in California in terms of the dollars that we oversee, and also the way that we have to really work with all of our state agencies has been really, really rewarding. So it's been terrific. I've got a group of about 180 people. We oversee nominally $10 billion of spend statewide. And that's just been really attractive to me.
I imagine that it's much more, and this is coming from somebody on the outside, so I've not worked in public procurement, and maybe this is one of the perceptions that we all have when we work in the private sector versus the public sector, but that it's very process-oriented. Is that the case? And if it is the case, how are you able to, really bring some things like agility and innovation and not necessarily work around it, but kind of go away from that perception of it's process-based, step-based?
I will freely agree that the rules that exist for private sector companies that are doing procurements are very different than what you would have in the public sector. We are required to advertise publicly our contracts. We're required to, negotiate our terms and conditions publicly. We do posting of all of our prices. So the interesting thing is that when you compare that to the private sector, it's not as fast as the private sector. But I think that word agile is a really great word because I think agility is more than just speed. Agility that we have that I could never enjoy in the private sector is I have 50 state partners. They're all buying the same things that I'm buying. They can talk to me about how their procurements went. They can talk to me about the prices that they paid. We can actually go do sourcing together. And those are the kinds of things in the private sector that it's hard to do because of the concerns about restraint of trade and things like that. So it really depends more on how you think about it. I've come to believe that agility is really a way of thinking. It's not about your circumstances, it's about your focus. One other good example of some agile work that we're doing, IT procurements for big projects have a long plagued the public sector, and you'll hear a lot of stories about failed IT projects. In the last year, we've been working with 18F out of the federal government, as well as our state CIO, to start doing these big project procurements in smaller bites. We're calling it agile procurement. You might refer to it as modular procurement. Instead of doing one great big project, we have a pool of pre-qualified suppliers that are in parallel working on multiple pieces, really more like you would see with like a building where you have multiple teams doing multiple pieces. And that's proven to be very agile too.
Does the transparency that you're able to bring, does that shorten, for example, the negotiation cycle? Because essentially the suppliers, everybody's on the same page. There's not that smoke and mirrors of trying to create positions of leverage so much, or trying to create the illusion of something that may not exist because, as you say, you got to publish a lot and you're able to talk to a lot of your peers.
I think it does in some important ways. Our legislature has passed a number of important laws that govern the way that we do procurement. These are important laws because they protect civil rights in many different ways, and they also prevent bad dealing by suppliers in sourcing from countries with conflicts. Those are terms and conditions that we do not negotiate. We have no authority to negotiate. And we're very transparent about them. We put them out there, and suppliers realize that they need to either accept them or not do business with the state of California. And what turns out is, and I understand this coming from the supplier side, suppliers almost always agree to all of our terms and conditions. And one of the things I didn't understand as well, I should say one of the things that maybe some folks in public sector don't understand as well, but you see on the private sector side, is there's probably not a single clause in that contract that the private sector provider is signing that the right business person that they couldn't agree to. It's never really a legal question. There's always the right business person in that company who can agree to do anything. And that knowledge has really helped us out.
Yeah, and perhaps so if things aren't as negotiable, it means that you don't have the backwards and forwards of the redlining that you constantly have in the private sector that can add so much time to a deal.
Yeah, we'll probably award this year more than 15,000 information technology contracts, just by example, and less than 5 of those will actually have any redlining go on at all.
That bit sounds like a dream to a buyer, I think. You mentioned earlier about partnership with SPLC, so Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, and that's actually something that I really want to talk about and focus on today is the work that you're doing at the state of California in terms of sustainability. But before I go there, sustainability kind of means, I think, a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I always struggle with, what's the definition of sustainability? So how do you define sustainability or sustainable purchasing in your work?
So for years, we defined our program as an environmentally preferred purchasing program, which really meant that we bought products that were green. They were had reduced impact to human health and the environment. In the last few years, we've really started to broaden our scope to include that word sustainable. And what we're doing, in addition to the green product buying, is we're also including things like supplier responsibility. So what does the supplier's carbon footprint look like? And there's good sources of that data through folks like the Carbon Disclosure Project. We've also added local sourcing as an important part of our definition. California, year in and year out, does about 25 to 27% of all that's purchasing from California small businesses. We do another 3% with California disabled veteran businesses. And so we've included in our definition these other elements that are not just about green products. It's about green companies and also about local sourcing. And we've got good studies from Sacramento State University Department of Economics that talk about the economic multiplier that local sourcing adds to our state and the kind of benefits for employment and local economic health. And those are the reasons why we've included those in our definition.
Right, really investing back in the local economy. And it's interesting you talk about the fact that you're looking further in the supply chain, so not just your suppliers, but tier 1, tier 2 suppliers, to see how, when you think about carbon footprints, but other environmental measures, that it's not something you're just confining to the first tier of suppliers that you're working with.
We reach in as far as we can legitimately understand. There is a limitation on the data, so I don't want to indicate that somehow we have figured out how to get very deep into the supply chain. But some of our terms and conditions do cover things like conflict minerals. They cover sourcing out of certain countries with poor records of human rights and civil rights. So we take a number of other steps, to really try to ensure as much responsibility as possible.
Yeah, I think just by asking the questions, it puts your supply base on notice that there's the expectation that if they do business with the state of California, they're going to be bound by those same requirements that you put on them, as they look within their supply chain. Because while you may not be able to go and track every single one of them, I'm sure you have the opportunity to do so if you so wished. It just leads to that way of thinking, I think, even if it's not something that can be directly attributed or that you can go and find every single corner of where every single sub-supplier is that's being used.
And I think suppliers understand, and they need to understand that the way that they do business has a really strong impact on their brand. And even if you're just a very jaded, capitalist and all you ever cared about was the bottom line, you would still be very, very passionate about protecting your brand, because brand equity at the end of the day is really the most important asset that any company has. And we understand how important it is to protect that and to do the right thing. So I think the message is an easy one for really good operators to understand. They embrace it. They want to strengthen their brand, and they can use that as a competitive advantage.
Then how important is sustainability in terms of prioritization for you as a CPO and for the state of California?
It's an interesting way of approaching it. In California, we have a governor, Governor Brown, who's been really a world leader in his passion for and his commitment to sustainability and everything that we do. So in a way, it's very easy for us to also be passionate about it. But there always are pockets of, resistance is the wrong word, but for some people it may come across as an inconvenience. So what we've really tried to get everyone to understand is that it's everyone's job. And, if you'll forgive me for a minute, we'll do a trip back in time. 30, 40 years ago, companies had quality departments. And it was like that department's job to make sure there were quality products. And they quickly learned that that was a failed approach, because quality had to be baked into every step of the process, and that was the only way it was going to be successful. The same is now coming true, I think, for sustainability. It's no longer the sustainability office's job. It's everyone's job. Every decision we make should take into account sustainability. And as we've gotten to that level, our success has really ramped up.
I'm sure there's times where there's conflict between maybe the sustainable choice and the lowest cost choice. So I'm interested, how do you kind of reconcile the two in terms of a focus or priority?
Well, I would just go back to that word value. Value is really the operative norm here. That's what we're looking for. It's a sign of maturity, I think, for when I talk to sourcing people, when I can tell that they understand the true cost of the things that they buy. So like take personal computers, for example. All of our contracts have a take-back clause. So after we're finished using the computer, if we don't, we have an asset reclamation program who may resell those to the public, but if they don't, then the OEM or the reseller has to come take those back. And that's because there's a cost to us of properly disposing of those. So not only do we save costs there, but we also enforce good practices with our take-back programs by holding them to, agreed-upon standards for the way that they recycle and handle that product. Again, it's back to value. What's the most important? It's not low cost. It's overall cost. It's reputation. It's quality of service, reliability, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, and I guess in the public organization, it's you're more mission driven too. So it's the commitments that you as a state have made to your constituents about the things that are important, and making sure that you're able to build that into essentially the business practices.
That is definitely a component of it. I've always believed, though, that if we are very good about looking at the overall cost, that the mission doesn't have to come at the expense of fiscal responsibility. Because, the funds that we're dealing with are precious. They're taxpayer funds. You and I, we both live in California. We pay our taxes. We want to know that the government's being responsible with our funds. But I do believe that taxpayers would rather have a government that is being fiscally prudent instead of cheap. And there's a big difference between those two.
Yeah, and you see lots of projects that were cheap projects. Those are often the ones that you see having all kinds of difficulty in terms of buying what you wanted and implementation. And those are often the ones that hit the news, not the ones that were...
Costs are out of this world high on those kinds of things. A failed project is very expensive.
I'd love for you to tell me a little bit about the journey that the state of California procurement team, your team, has taken. You have mandates, I think, in terms of legislation. You obviously have a governor who's very passionate about that. But how would you translate that into essentially business practices?
The program has really grown over time, again, from focusing on products to now focusing on the supply base. But the other thing that we're really working on is just helping our departments to make it easy for them to make the right choice. So one of the things that we've done is with our statewide contracts, is we've really greened those contracts by always providing sustainable choices on those contracts. And a good example is our desktop computers and our servers. There's a standard, Energy Star standard, that imputes a specific level of energy savings. We've always tried to source below that level. And as a result, we've been able to deliver some pretty impressive savings of energy that I can talk about later. But, the journey includes making it easy for people to do the right thing so that they can just do their job, because they're all running programs. And even though sustainability is all of our jobs, it's easier if we're helping them do that job for them. The other thing we did this year and last year is we launched a new statewide financial system. So now, for the first time, departments can actually look in the data from the financial system and determine what % of their purchases were actually green purchases. And by green, we would track like one of 5 or 6 different parameters that would make something green. Then they can look at that, and not only can they look at how green the purchases were, they can look at where they didn't make a green choice and what their different options are. And that's a system that we're delivering in pieces. We rolled out the first piece, which was an overall analysis of the state spend, just a week ago at a big statewide meeting. And that's going to be an effort that we focus on for the next 12 to 18 months.
Interesting. Would you be able to share with me what some of those parameters are in terms of how you determine a green purchase?
Sure, I'll be happy to. So for us, the major categories are water conservation, which seems ironic given all the rain.
Right.
But there will come a day again when we're challenged for water. We know that
it's feast or famine, isn't it?
It really is. Air emissions is certainly one of the most common ones you hear about in California with all of our regulations around carbon emissions. Toxicity, very critical. Energy efficiency, which I talked about a moment ago. And then finally, resource conservation, which California's been a pioneer in its recycling program, for decades. So those are the kind of main ones. Again, water conservation, air emissions, toxicity, energy efficiency, and resource conservation. Thanks. And then, in addition to that, we've been an active participant with the U.S. EPA in developing the Eco-Labels program. And we have signed on to and support a number of third-party certifications and eco-labels that help us very quickly, label something as a green purchase.
So as you have those standards, do you set targets then on agencies or, users so that you can measure how they stack up in terms of a target or in terms of a benchmark, or perhaps in terms of maybe some commitments that have been made to reach certain levels of emissions, for example? I just wondered how that will then end up tie into driving actions, because obviously it's much easier if you have metrics behind it to drive some of those actions.
Yeah, absolutely. So there are targets in a couple of really important areas. First is in the recycling world. Cal EPA through Cal Recycle has category targets, I believe, in 11 or 12 specific categories. And departments are required every year to report their attainment to those on CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions generally. The state also has very aggressive targets and is measuring those through our green scorecard. Part of what we've done here at DGS is to really drive use of zero-emission vehicles and to move our buildings to the highest levels of LEED that we can, and really embracing zero-net energy buildings in all of our new buildings as well. So measurement is a big part of this. I would say that in the green procurement area, there's still a lot more that we can do, especially around things like toxicity and water conservation. But a couple of really cool numbers that we've been able to publish very recently is that through the purchasing alone, we've been able to drive 12 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent greenhouse gas emission savings, as well as over 2.166 gigawatts of energy saved. So to translate that, that's enough power to power 314 homes in California for a year, just based on making smarter choices on the electronics that we buy.
So as you go on your journey to obviously embed sustainable thinking into pretty much everything that you do and into your decision making, I'm sure there's been some ups, there's been some downs. You've had to convince some of why it's an important thing to do. And there'll be a lot of CPOs listening to this and procurement leaders listening, thinking that, well, I don't really have the mandate in my organization, but I think this is something that's important. It's something that I want to do, even it's something that I'm personally passionate about. What guidance would you give them in terms of maybe some of the lessons that you've learned, but how you've been able to convince others that this is important?
I think with suppliers, I always go back to the discussion we had earlier about their brand and brand equity. I think that, and my kids teach me this all the time, the perception of what a successful company is has really changed dramatically in the last 5 to maybe 10, 15 years. Doing the right thing, being a responsible company has to be at the very top of the list. So then why would government be any different, right? And even if you don't have a mandate in your state, I think that most people would find that their staff will be very energized about doing the right thing, and that there certainly wouldn't be any downside to start making some changes in this area. I am pragmatic enough to know that in the public sector, most of what we do has to be authorized in law, and that there always will be people who will criticize you if you're "quote unquote" driving outside your lane. So I don't encourage anyone to invoke the wrath of their constituents. They need to operate within their authorized parameters, but doing the right thing doesn't have to be hard. And what I found is that we have pretty general enough rules and regulations that allow us to do the right thing without a lot of explicit guidance. In fact, the best rules, the best laws and regulations are general, and they allow the administration to really have freedom to be excellent within the overall standard.
Mm-hmm. So how about when you think back to your days pre-California, when you're on the private sector side with Levi, with Dell, how would you position something like that in an environment where you don't have the constraints of regulatory requirements or laws, essentially, but it's more about influence. It's more about influencing people.
I would say that it really matters a lot in those environments, the direction that you're getting from the top. I had a really amazing experience at Levi. They really live their values. And just a quick story, it's a public story, so I can share it. There was a time in the apparel industry when there were a lot of unethical sourcing activities happening, especially throughout Asia. And the country of Saipan specifically had sued most of the major apparel manufacturers and had won settlements for things like, poor labor practices. And Levi never did settle. And our chief counsel at the time, wonderful gentleman by the name of Al Moreno, wouldn't settle. And the reason he wouldn't settle is he knew that the company hadn't committed any of these acts. And so it's an interesting choice that he was making. In a way, it was kind of risky, right? It was just kind of risky to the brand by not settling. But because of his courage, and that's one of the values at Levi, because of his courage, ultimately, in the end, the country issued a public statement recognizing that Levi hadn't actually committed anything wrong. So think about that in terms of your brand equity. Really, really strong courage because you're doing the right thing. But he was only able to do that because he knew that the company had been doing the right thing and that it was built into the fiber and values of the company.
Yeah, in his mind, there wasn't a risk in doing that because he was comfortable with the position he was taking. A lot of procurement organizations will be listening and perhaps thinking that I want to do something in terms of sustainable purchasing. And I'm sure that there's some categories that lend themselves to, being either good places to start, good places to pilot schemes, or good ways of just showing an example to the rest of the organization to say, hey, this is possible in this area. Let's try and expand our thinking into other categories. I wonder from your experience if there are any specific categories that you would advise somebody to look at first when they think about buying more sustainably.
Sure. I think there are a lot of categories where you can have some easy wins. And I'm not being dismissive of your question, but I would say that before you just jump on any categories, really work on the attitude of the organization. Get everybody to buy in, because there are some really great categories that you can go after. But if it's not bought in, if it can't be consistent, then it won't be sustained, and then it can come off looking like it was opportunistic,
right?
And it can breed some cynicism, because with any effort, you'll get people who will want to go 100%. Yeah, I love this. Let's go do it. But if you can't sustain it, then it really can be demotivating. So I would just say really make sure that you're getting leadership from the top and get the attitude right. But then, if I could offer some ideas on categories, just some really great ones that we're seeing wonderful success with right now. Obviously, remanufactured toner cartridges are an easy one to go after. They cost less. They're good for the environment. For years, industry has tried to indicate that the quality of those cartridges is subpar and that they'll damage your equipment. We've done extensive testing with our own engineers. We haven't found that to be the case. We've only found that it is actually a really great positive. So there's an easy one. We have started a program in the last year to buy renewable diesel. Renewable diesel is a type of diesel that's made from only renewable products, no petroleum involved. And our Air Resources Board actually assigns a carbon index, a carbon intensity index to the supply chain. So we can tell what the total carbon intensity is for that. And we've replaced a majority of all of our diesel purchases from petroleum to renewable diesel. And by the way, the price is equal to or less than your regular diesel too. So good examples of things that you can do that don't actually have to cost more money. Light bulbs is a great area to focus. Pushing for reduced mercury content light bulbs has been a big success. Now we're all moving to LED as well. Again, easy categories to go for because LED consume a lot less electricity. They're easier to manage. The cost without ballast, things like that, makes them a lot more attractive. There are lots of great categories to go after.
Yeah, it sounds like it's figuring where to start, and then it has changed I know change always seems to be slower than you would hope. So about picking those and showing the examples and then trying to expand, is that how you would recommend that people go, or that just go and do a few categories at once and take it from there, see what happens?
I think if you have a commitment, then you can start and be a bit opportunistic. But I also think it's important to figure out what is going to make the most difference. Where are you spending the most money, and where can you really get a bang for the buck? So I'm kind of not a fan of the concept of low-hanging fruit. I realize that it can be there, but it's probably low-hanging for a reason. It's probably not that attractive.
Right.
Okay? So let's go figure out what would be really impactful and really make a statement, and let's get everyone behind that and do that instead. And so, again, for California, it's things like our buildings really driving, excellence in LEED and in zero net energy. It's in our vehicles. We've replaced. We're ahead of the governor's goals. I think we're already above 15% zero emission vehicles. We're headed to 20 very quickly ahead of schedule. Those are things that I think can make a big difference.
How do you judge the impact then of the work that you're doing and your sustainable purchasing strategies? So how do you figure if it's successful or not?
Well, it's some of the things that we talked about before, literally tracking, the metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions or energy savings and things like that. I would also say that our program of measurement is continually growing. It's not something that I wouldn't say that we're world class at. We're getting better at it. And it is in a way maybe one of the hardest things to do. It will take time and resources to develop because you have to be able to track what you've actually purchased. We're not okay with just estimates. We look at what did we actually buy. What is our engineers go in, they look at the deltas in performance from the non-green products, and we actually do measurements on those. So it takes some time and effort. But it's definitely something that's worth doing.
Yeah, you talked earlier as well about the fact that it's not just things that have environmental impact, but you also look at local sourcing, investing in the local economy and small business being a big part of that. I was interested if you approach small businesses differently in terms of how you contract, how you work with them, taking into account the fact that they are small business versus the Fortune 500 companies who I'm sure you also work with across your portfolio.
Yeah, that's a really big part of our program. I have an award-winning small business and disabled veteran business certification and outreach branch. They have won over 40 awards from the community and national organizations for their work with these firms. We have over 30,000 certified firms. And we do year in and year out more than $2 billion, almost $2.5 billion of this with small business, and between $300 and $400 million with our disabled veteran businesses. And that stuff we measure very carefully. We report it annually. We post all the reports publicly. And we make it easy for our buyers to find those businesses. They're all loaded in our procurement systems. And the state, from the legislature and the governor, have agreed that those businesses can get a 5% business preference, for example. Or like one of the hard things to do in public procurement is just to conduct a bid. It can take a really long time. But under our small business code, departments can go out to buy anything up to $250,000 and get simple phone quotes from two small businesses or two DVBEs or veteran businesses. That's an incentive of time that has really helped improve our performance.
Yeah, it actually incents people to actually work with small business too, doesn't it? If they are able to cut down the time it takes to bring somebody on board by using a local or small business versus a larger one.
Yeah, making people's job easier is a fantastic motivation. I can tell you that right now.
Especially, I'm guessing, in the public procurement space, when we talked about before, some of the process that you have to go through for a lot of the things that you buy. I'm sure that people naturally gravitate towards opportunities to make their lives easier. What's next? You talked about the fact you've just launched, I think, the initiative related to the new software platform that you put in place and starting to benchmark a lot of your numbers. But what's the next 12 months look like in terms of your sustainable purchasing journey?
So a couple of things are going to occupy a lot of our time. The first is the supply responsibility piece. Again, working with the Carbon Disclosure Project and other data sources to figure out, how many of our suppliers are we tracking and at what level and what parameters. We're just starting that. Then the second one is that SPLC, the Sustainable Purchasing Leadership Council, and NASPO are doing some joint research on a state-level benchmark. And that's when that's completed, we're hoping that will allow us to really measure the effectiveness, or at least the maturity of our program, and then hopefully other states will buy in, and we can start benchmarking with each other, not to compare to see who's better, but to learn.
Yeah, where the best practice is.
And that we should do what Washington's doing, or what Oregon's doing, or what New York, and I think that others could learn from us too.
So I have a couple of people-related questions. One of them is still thinking about the notion of public versus private. And if there's listeners who have an opportunity, they're in the private sector right now and have the chance to move into public sector, or are just thinking about where to go with their next career move, what would you say to them in terms of kind of the differences and perhaps why they should think about moving into public sector versus private sector?
Sure. There's a famous saying that goes like this: the joy that we feel in our lives has little to do with the circumstances of our lives, but everything to do with the focus of our lives. And I just love the focus of public sector procurement. I've always been a big fan of government, not of government, but of politics and how things get done. I've always been kind of a junkie that way. And as a young kid, I saw my dad, who was a small business owner, go through some real trials and try to deal with the government. So I kind of have this inborn passion to make government better. So anyone who feels that, who wants to participate in that, I would say it's a great time to get involved with public sector. The silver tsunami is hitting the public sector particularly hard. There's a massive turnover that's happening now. It's been happening. It's going to continue to happen. There's really great opportunities. You don't just have to come in at an entry level. You can come in at a middle manager or executive level and very quickly have an impact on what your government's doing. And that's very rewarding. We get messages from our customers, and they'll tell us things like, "You've renewed my faith in government. I never thought I could get this kind of result out of government. I love, fill in the blank, Bobby or whoever, Danetta. You won't believe how they've benefited my small business." That's the kind of stuff that you take that home, and that's very, very rewarding.
Yeah, and often missing from when essentially we're working to maximize shareholder value on the private side. You don't often have that connection with the impact that you're having on, the real world, because it's so, I don't know, it's about numbers, not about people.
Can be. I enjoyed my time in the private sector, and I enjoyed the focus. I learned a lot, and I had great experiences, and so I don't begrudge anyone that experience. I just have found, for me personally, a lot better focus here.
My final question today, and it's again a career question. You've obviously managed and led a lot of teams within procurement space. You talked about, I think you had 180 people within your team in the state of California. What are some of the things that you look for when you're thinking about who are the people whose careers you want to develop, or that you think are showing the potential, to step into leadership positions? What differentiates or helps those people stand out from the crowd?
I'm glad you asked this question, because there's just a couple of things that really matter a lot to me. First and foremost is the ability to write. So much of what we do has to be reduced to writing. You have to make a proposal. You've got to make a finding. You've got to convince someone who doesn't sit near you that they need to buy into something. Too few of the professionals I work with, not just here, but also in the private sector, have the ability to be compelling, concise writers. So that's a really important skill. And quickly thereafter is just also your verbal communication, the ability to be, have presence with others, and to, have, that kind of social grace and elegance. I also think analytics are really important. People that can make their case by going and doing the research, by bringing forth the numbers, almost always, rise to the top. So those two things are really important. Obviously, things like passion, ability to work with others are really critical too. What I would tell people is you don't have to have procurement experience to be really good at procurement. You and I talked, I think, earlier that a lot of people quote unquote fall into procurement from other practices. That's appropriate. That's fine. You just need to know how to get deals done. You need to understand how to convince and work with other people. So much of what we do is influencing others over whom we have no authority. If you can do that, then you can be very successful in procurement. I'll go back to the word I used earlier, partnerships. If I could encourage people to do one thing, it would be partner. When we work collaboratively wherever you can, you get more done and you open a lot of doors, and it's a lot more rewarding. Almost all jobs are given to people that are already known, if I'm making sense. We hire people that we know or that are referred to us by someone that we know. If you're not collaborating and partnering, that next new opportunity may not really show up on your doorstep.
Jim, I know it's time to start wrapping up. So what I'm going to do, Jim, is I'm going to include links to State of California via your department. They can learn a little bit more. And I think there's some links to the EPP program out there on the internet too. I'll include those in the show notes for today. Those are going to be at artofprocurement.com/California. It's artofprocurement.com/California. And I want to just thank you, Jim, so much for taking the time to share your journey at the State of California and also on kind of some of the challenges, but some of the opportunities that there are for procurement professionals and procurement leaders to really bring value above savings in terms of thinking more about sustainability. So thank you so much for your time.
It's been a privilege, and I look forward to being a subscriber. Thank you, Phil.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.